The small hospital room, filled with pale afternoon light, carried the sterile scent of antiseptic. Yet there was also a faint sweetness in the air, like lavender hand lotion, as if someone had tried to bring a touch of comfort into the space. Aaron Carter, a tall, wiry young man of 23, adjusted the stiff volunteer badge pinned to his jacket. The badge felt like a reminder of where he was in life, somewhere between being useful and being invisible. Aaron carried a tray with a bowl of chicken soup, steam curling gently from its surface. He paused at the doorway, his sneakers scuffing softly against the linoleum floor. Inside the room, an elderly woman lay propped against pillows, her white hair combed neatly into soft waves, her hands, veined and delicate, fiddled with the edge of a blanket, while her eyes lingered on the rain-spattered window. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Hathaway," Aaron said, his voice warm yet cautious. He stepped closer, placing the tray on the small table by her bed. "I brought you some soup. I heard it's the best thing on the menu today." Mrs. Hathaway turned her head slowly, her pale blue eyes sharper than Aaron had expected. They were the kind of eyes that seemed to take in more than they let on. For a long moment, she said nothing, her gaze flicking from the soup to Aaron. "I didn't ask for soup," she said finally, her voice soft but tinged with stubbornness. Aaron smiled, though his hands fidgeted at his sides. "No, you didn't. But it's here if you want it. And I thought I'd sit with you for a while, if that's okay." Mrs. Hathaway studied him for another beat, her expression inscrutable. Then, with an almost imperceptible shrug, she said, "If you're going to sit, pull the chair closer. I don't like shouting." Aaron chuckled under his breath, dragging the metal chair toward her bedside. As he settled in, the scent of lilacs wafted faintly from her skin, a soft contrast to the stark hospital air. Outside, the rain tapped steadily against the window, its rhythm filling the silence between them. "You don't look like you belong here," Mrs. Hathaway said suddenly, her tone direct but not unkind. "Why are you wasting your time volunteering?" Aaron hesitated. The question hit harder than he expected. He scratched at the edge of his frayed sleeve, stalling. "I don't think it's a waste," he said finally. "I guess I just wanted to feel useful, and it seemed like a good way to help people." Mrs. Hathaway raised an eyebrow, her lips curving faintly. "Useful, huh? And what exactly do you do when you're not serving soup to old women?" Aaron chuckled nervously. "Not much these days. I just graduated with a degree in English literature. Thought I'd be writing novels by now, or working in publishing. Turns out the world isn't exactly waiting for another writer." Her gaze softened, and for the first time, Aaron thought he saw a flicker of something understanding, perhaps, or sympathy. "Let me tell you something, young man," she said, her voice quieter now. "Life has a funny way of teaching you what's truly worth your time. And it often does so when you least expect it." Aaron tilted his head, her words lingering in the air. "Do you really believe that? That it all works out somehow?" Mrs. Hathaway's faint smile deepened into something closer to fondness. "Of course. But it's not about waiting for it to work out. It's about what you choose to do with the time you have." Her words settled into Aaron's chest, like the weight of a long-forgotten truth. He thought of the unfinished manuscript on his laptop, tucked away under a dozen excuses. He thought of his father's disappointed expression when he told him he wasn't going into finance. He thought of all the ways he'd been trying to prove his worth, only to end up here, in a hospital room, serving soup. "Do you have any family visiting soon?" Aaron asked, shifting the subject. Mrs. Hathaway's gaze turned back to the rain outside. "No one's coming," she said after a pause. Her tone wasn't bitter, but there was a quiet resignation in it. "My husband passed years ago, and my daughter lives across the country. She has her own life now, as she should." Aaron felt a pang of empathy, one he didn't quite know how to put into words. "I'm sorry," he said softly. Mrs. Hathaway glanced at him, her expression softening. "Don't be. That's just how life goes. People come and go like leaves in the wind. The important thing is to leave something behind that matters." Her words stayed with Aaron long after their conversation ended. He spent the rest of his shift by her side, listening as she shared fragments of her life. She spoke of her late husband, Charles, with a wistful smile, recounting how he had once surprised her with a garden full of blooming roses. She described her childhood on a farm, where the days were long but filled with small, quiet joys like the way the sun felt on her face after the first thaw of spring. Each story felt like a glimpse into a world Aaron didn't want to leave. He realized then that Mrs. Hathaway wasn't just a lonely woman in a hospital bed. She was a library of memories, and every moment he spent with her felt like reading a page he didn't want to end. When Aaron finally left the hospital that evening, he paused under the awning as the rain continued to fall. He looked back at the building, at the small window where Mrs. Hathaway's room might be, and felt a strange mix of emotions. Sadness for the loneliness she seemed to carry so gracefully, and hope that, in some small way, his presence had made a difference. What Aaron didn't know was that this was the beginning of a journey that would not only change his life but illuminate a truth he hadn't yet dared to believe, that even the smallest acts of kindness could ripple outward, creating a legacy far greater than he could imagine. The next day, Aaron walked through the hospital doors with a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't sure what it was about Mrs. Hathaway, but she had a way of pulling him into her world. There was something grounding about her, like the roots of an old tree, weathered but enduring. When he reached her room, he found her sitting up, her posture surprisingly straight, her hands resting lightly on her lap. "You're back," she said, a faint smile touching her lips. Aaron grinned as he pulled the chair closer to her bedside. "I am. I figured you could use some company. Plus, I wanted to check on how the soup worked out." She let out a soft laugh, the sound like a brittle leaf stirring in the wind. "I didn't eat it. Hospital soup has never been a favorite of mine." "Well," Aaron said, leaning back in his chair, "next time I'll bring something better. Do you like cookies?" Her eyes twinkled, though she maintained her composed demeanor. "If they're homemade, I won't turn them down." Aaron chuckled. "Noted." For a while they sat in comfortable silence. Mrs. Hathaway's gaze drifted toward the window, where pale winter light filtered through the rain-spattered glass. Aaron studied her profile, wondering how someone so composed had managed to carry so much solitude without crumbling under its weight. "Tell me something," Mrs. Hathaway said suddenly, her voice breaking the stillness. "Sure," Aaron replied. "What do you want to know?" "Why did you choose literature?" she asked, turning to him. "Of all the things you could have studied, why books?" Aaron hesitated, caught off guard by the question. He thought back to his childhood, to the hours he had spent in the local library, while his parents argued at home. Books had been his refuge, their pages a gateway to worlds where he could lose himself, even if just for a little while. "I guess. Books always felt like home to me," he said finally. "No matter what was going on in my life, I could pick up a book and feel like I belonged somewhere." Mrs. Hathaway nodded, her expression softening. "And do you still feel that way?" Aaron hesitated again. He thought about the manuscript sitting unfinished on his laptop, the way he avoided looking at it most days. "Not always," he admitted. "Lately I've been wondering if I'm good enough. If what I have to say even matters." Mrs. Hathaway regarded him for a long moment, her pale blue eyes filled with something he couldn't quite name. "The question isn't whether it matters to everyone," she said gently. "It's whether it matters to you." Her words settled in Aaron's chest, heavy and undeniable. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a soft knock sounded at the door. A nurse entered, carrying a tray with Mrs. Hathaway's evening medication. "It's time for your pills," Mrs. Hathaway, the nurse said with a kind smile. Mrs. Hathaway sighed but didn't argue. As the nurse arranged the small paper cup and glass of water on her tray, Aaron rose from his chair. "I'll let you rest," he said. "But I'll be back tomorrow. And maybe I'll bring those cookies." Mrs. Hathaway's smile deepened. "Don't make promises you can't keep." Aaron chuckled. "I'll see you tomorrow." As he walked out of the room, he felt a strange mix of emotions: gratitude for the connection they were building, and a gnawing curiosity about the woman she had been before the hospital walls became her world. The next morning, Aaron woke up early to bake a batch of chocolate chip cookies. He wasn't much of a baker, but he followed the recipe closely, determined to keep his promise. By the time he arrived at the hospital, the cookies were nestled in a neatly wrapped tin, their warm, sweet aroma wafting through the air. When he entered Mrs. Hathaway's room, her face lit up with surprise. "You actually did it." Erin grinned, setting the tin on the table beside her bed. "I don't break promises." She opened the tin and picked up a cookie, inspecting it with the air of a connoisseur. After taking a small bite, she nodded approvingly. "Not bad, young man. Not bad at all." Erin laughed, settling into his usual chair. "I'll take that as high praise." As they talked, Mrs. Hathaway began to share more of her life with him. She spoke of her childhood on a farm in the Midwest, where the days were long and filled with chores but also with small, vivid joys like the scent of fresh hay and the way the fireflies danced at dusk. She spoke of her husband, Charles, with a warmth that softened her voice, recounting how he used to leave handwritten poems for her to find in unexpected places. "He wasn't a perfect man," she said, her gaze distant. "But he made me laugh, and he made me feel seen. That was enough." Erin listened intently, soaking up every detail. He had never known his grandparents, and hearing Mrs. Hathaway's stories felt like being gifted a piece of history he hadn't realized he was missing. "Do you ever miss those days?" he asked gently. Mrs. Hathaway smiled faintly. "I miss the people. But the days themselves? No. Life isn't meant to be lived in the past, Erin. It's meant to be carried forward." Her words stayed with Erin long after their conversation ended. That night, as he sat at his laptop, he opened his manuscript for the first time in weeks. He reread the opening paragraphs, feeling a spark of something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. With Mrs. Hathaway's words echoing in his mind, he began to type. What Erin didn't know was that this spark would soon grow into something far greater than he could have imagined. The days turned into weeks, and Erin's visits to Mrs. Hathaway became the highlight of his routine. Each time, he came armed with something new to share: an anecdote, a favorite quote, or even another batch of cookies. In return, Mrs. Hathaway continued to offer glimpses of her past, painting vivid pictures of the life she had lived. It wasn't just her words, but the way she told her stories that captivated Erin. She had a way of pulling him into her memories, making him feel as though he'd been there too. One rainy afternoon, Erin arrived to find her sitting by the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The nurse had helped her into a wheelchair so she could watch the rain, and her gaze seemed far away, as if she were searching for something beyond the streaked glass. "Afternoon, Mrs. Hathaway," Erin greeted, holding up a book as he entered. "I brought a classic, The Secret Garden. Thought we could read a little." She turned to him, her lips curving into a faint smile. "That was one of my favorites as a girl. My mother used to read it to me by the fire." Erin settled into the chair beside her, opening the book to the first page. As he read aloud, his voice steady and warm, Mrs. Hathaway closed her eyes, leaning her head against the back of her wheelchair. At first, Erin thought she had fallen asleep, but when he paused, she spoke. "You have a good voice for stories," she said softly. "Have you ever thought about recording one?" Erin laughed lightly. "I think I'll stick to writing for now." Speaking of which, he hesitated, then pulled a notebook from his bag. "I wanted to show you something. It's part of the story I've been working on." Mrs. Hathaway's eyes lit up with curiosity. "Well, don't just sit there, let's hear it." Erin cleared his throat, suddenly nervous. He wasn't used to reading his work out loud, especially not to someone he admired. But as he began, his words grew steadier. The story was a piece of fiction he'd been toying with for months, about a boy who finds solace in a forgotten garden, much like the one in the book he'd brought. As he read, Mrs. Hathaway listened intently, her sharp blue eyes fixed on him. When he finished, she said, "It's lovely, Erin. You have a gift." "Thank you," he said, his cheeks warming. "I'm still working on it. There's a lot to figure out." She reached out, her frail hand brushing his arm. "Stories are never perfect. They're just honest. Keep writing yours." As the winter days stretched on, Mrs. Hathaway's health began to wane. Her once sharp voice grew softer, her sentences shorter. Erin noticed how often she needed to rest, how the nurses lingered a little longer during their visits. But even as her body grew weaker, her spirit remained resolute. One evening, as Erin sat by her bed, she spoke with a sudden intensity. "Erin, there's something I've been meaning to tell you." "What is it?" he asked gently. She took a moment, as though gathering her thoughts. "Before I met my husband, I used to write. Nothing fancy, just little stories and poems. I would scribble them in notebooks and tuck them away under my mattress." Erin smiled. "That's amazing. Do you still have them?" Her gaze dropped to her lap. "No. I let them go a long time ago. Life, well, it swept me along. There was always something more pressing, a job to keep, a child to raise. I don't regret my choices, Erin. But sometimes I wonder what might have been, if I'd let myself dream a little longer." Her words struck a chord deep within him. He thought of the manuscript on his laptop, the one he had been too afraid to finish. He thought of how often he doubted his own voice, afraid it wouldn't measure up to the expectations of others. "I think your stories are still with you," Erin said softly. "Even if they're not on paper anymore." Mrs. Hathaway's eyes shimmered, and she reached for his hand. "Perhaps. But you, Erin, you still have time. Don't wait for the right moment to start living your story. Life doesn't hand you permission slips. You have to take the leap." Her words stayed with him long after their conversation ended. That night, as he sat at his desk, he opened his laptop and stared at the unfinished draft. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of clarity. He began to write, letting the words flow freely, unburdened by doubt or hesitation. Mrs. Hathaway's voice echoed in his mind as he typed, urging him forward. A few days later, Erin arrived at the hospital to find Mrs. Hathaway's room empty. Panic gripped him as he searched for a nurse, his thoughts racing. When he finally found someone, they explained that she had been moved to a private room. Her condition had worsened, and they weren't sure how much time she had left. Erin entered the new room with a heavy heart. Mrs. Hathaway was lying in bed, her breathing shallow, her face pale but peaceful. She opened her eyes when she heard him, and her lips curled into a faint smile. "You came," she whispered. "Of course I did," Erin said, pulling a chair close to her bed. "I'm here." For hours he stayed by her side, holding her hand and talking to her softly. He told her about the progress he'd made on his story and read her a passage he had written just the night before. Though her voice was faint, she listened intently, her eyes filled with quiet pride. As evening fell, Mrs. Hathaway looked at him one last time, her expression serene. "Erin, remember what I said. Live your story." "I will," he promised, his voice breaking. "I promise." With a final, peaceful breath, she closed her eyes, leaving Erin with an ache in his chest and a profound sense of gratitude. She had given him more than he could ever repay, a belief in himself that he hadn't known he needed. Erin stayed long after she was gone, letting the weight of her words settle into his heart. When he finally left the hospital, he looked up at the night sky, feeling as though a small part of her would always be with him. What Erin didn't yet realize was how much her influence would ripple through his life, leading him toward a purpose greater than he could have imagined. Erin spent the days after Mrs. Hathaway's passing in quiet reflection. Her absence left a stillness that felt both heavy and hollow, but the weight of her final words, "Live your story," echoed within him. They weren't just a passing sentiment. They were a call to action, a reminder that life wasn't about waiting for the perfect moment, but about choosing to create something meaningful in the moments you had. 1 week after her funeral, Erin received a call from the hospital. It was one of the nurses who had cared for Mrs. Hathaway. "There's something here for you," she said gently. "Mrs. Hathaway left it for us to give to you." Curious and a little apprehensive, Erin made his way to the hospital, where the nurse handed him a small package wrapped in brown paper. "She mentioned it to me once," the nurse added. "Said she wanted you to have it." Erin carried the package home and unwrapped it with trembling fingers. Inside was a journal, its leather cover cracked and worn with age. He opened it to find Mrs. Hathaway's familiar handwriting filling the pages. They were stories, snippets of her life, reflections, and even a few poems. Some were complete, others unfinished, but every word felt alive, as though she had poured pieces of herself onto the paper. "Aaron," she had written on the first page, "I didn't finish everything I wanted to say, but perhaps you can. You have a gift. Don't let it slip away. Share these or don't, it's your choice. But whatever you do, live boldly, or write your story and trust that it matters. M.H." Aaron's chest tightened and his throat ached with emotion. He spent hours reading the journal, losing himself in the fragments of her life. There were vivid descriptions of her childhood on the farm, tender moments with her husband Charles, and musings on the passage of time. One poem, in particular, stood out. "When time slows and the world falls quiet, it is not the ticking clock I hear, but the echoes of love left behind, waiting to bloom anew." The words felt like a gift meant just for him. That night, Aaron opened his laptop and began to write again. But this time, something had shifted. His story was no longer just his own. It was woven with Mrs. Hathaway's voice, her wisdom, and the legacy she had entrusted to him. He combined her fragments with his own, creating a narrative that celebrated connection, resilience, and the enduring power of stories. Writing wasn't easy. There were nights when doubt crept in, whispering that his work wasn't good enough, that no one would care. But each time he faltered, he opened Mrs. Hathaway's journal and reread her note, her encouragement pushing him forward. Months later, Aaron sat in a small cafe with a publisher from a local press. He had submitted his manuscript on a whim, unsure if it would resonate with anyone beyond himself. To his surprise, the publisher had called within days, saying the book was powerful and deeply human, and wanting to meet with him. "It's not just a book," the publisher said, tapping the manuscript with her pen. "It's a reminder of the connections we all need. Stories like this don't just entertain, they heal." Hearing those words, Aaron felt a warmth spread through him. A quiet pride that felt unlike anything he'd known before. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe in the value of his work. When the book was published, Aaron hosted a small launch event at a local bookstore. The cover was simple but elegant, with the title "Echoes of Love" embossed in soft gold. Beneath the title, the dedication read, "For Mrs. Marian Hathaway, who taught me to live my story." Aaron didn't expect a large crowd, but the bookstore was filled with readers, hospital staff who had cared for Mrs. Hathaway, and even strangers who had heard about the book through word of mouth. As he spoke about the inspiration behind the stories, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the woman who had changed his life. Later that evening, as he signed copies, a middle-aged woman approached him, her eyes red-rimmed but kind. "Your book reminded me of my grandmother," she said softly. "She passed a few years ago, but reading this, it felt like I got to sit with her again, even if just for a little while. Thank you." Aaron's voice caught in his throat as he responded, "Thank you for sharing that. It means everything." In the months that followed, Echoes of Love found its way into more hands and hearts than Aaron had ever imagined. It didn't make him famous or wealthy, but it brought him something far more valuable: purpose. Letters poured in from readers who shared how the book had touched their lives, how it had reminded them of loved ones, or inspired them to pursue dreams they'd long abandoned. Aaron often thought of Mrs. Hathaway during those moments. He imagined her sitting by the window, the rain tapping softly on the glass, her knowing smile offering quiet encouragement. Her journal remained on his desk, a constant reminder of the gift she had given him, not just her stories, but her belief in his. One sunny spring afternoon, Aaron visited her grave for the first time since the funeral. He knelt down and placed a small bouquet of tulips, her favorite, on the headstone. "I hope I've made you proud," he said softly, his voice carried away by the breeze. "Thank you for everything." As he stood there, he felt a quiet sense of peace. Mrs. Hathaway's legacy wasn't just in her stories or in his book. It was in the way she had inspired him to believe in himself and to create something meaningful. And as he walked away, he carried her words with him, like a compass guiding him forward. Aaron didn't know exactly what the future held, but he no longer feared it. He had a story to live, one filled with echoes of love, kindness, and the lessons of a woman who had reminded him of what truly mattered.